My name is Mara. At Thanksgiving, my brother stood up from the table, tapped his knife against his glass, and said, "We talked it over. We think it's best if you step back from this family." My mother nodded. My sister-in-law smiled at her plate, and my father, the man I had been wiring $800 a month to for the past 4 years, just cleared his throat and reached for the rolls. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the previous 3 weeks building a case. $47,000. That's what I added up. That's what I had given this family since I turned 22 and got my first real job. And the moment I stopped being useful, they found a way to vote me out before I could ask for any of it back. Let me take you back to the beginning. I drove 4 hours to get to that house. I remember the exact playlist I had going, some true crime podcast I'd been saving, and I remember turning it off when I hit the county line, because I needed to mentally prepare. That's what going home felt like. Something to prepare for. I stopped at the grocery store on Route 9 and bought a cranberry tart because I knew my mother would comment if I showed up empty-handed, and I knew she'd also comment if I brought something she didn't like. I stood in the baked goods aisle for 6 minutes picking between 2 nearly identical tarts. That's the kind of math you do when you've spent your whole life trying to get it right for people who've already decided you're wrong. The house smelled like it always did. Dried herbs and something slightly burnt underneath, like my sister-in-law had been cooking since morning but had forgotten one thing on the stove. My nephew ran at me from the hallway, arms wide, and for about 30 seconds everything felt manageable. Then my brother appeared in the doorframe, and his face did that thing it does, that quick reset, like he'd just made a decision right there, standing in his socks. "You made it," he said. "Not glad you made it. Just you made it." Like I was a package he'd been waiting on and wasn't sure the contents would be right. Dinner was loud in the way that quiet families get loud, everyone talking around the thing nobody wants to say. My sister-in-law had made 3 kinds of pie. My father held court from his end of the table like he always did, big voice, bigger opinions, and my mother laughed at everything he said a half-second too late. I sat between my nephew and an empty chair that used to belong to my grandmother, and I watched the whole performance like I'd seen it 100 times. Because I had. I was on my second helping of sweet potato when my brother stood up. He didn't clink his glass. He just stood and the table went quiet the way it does when someone has rehearsed something. "I think we need to be honest about some things," he said. And I remember thinking, okay, here we go. Some family meeting thing about the holidays, logistics, who's hosting Christmas. I set my fork down. He looked at me, not at anyone else. "We talked, all of us, and we think it's best if you step back from this family for a while, maybe permanently. We feel like the dynamic you create isn't healthy for any of us." I waited for someone to laugh, or correct him, or even look uncomfortable. My mother nodded, slow and practiced. My sister-in-law said, "We all agreed, Mara. It's not personal." My father reached for the rolls. I sat there for what felt like a full minute. The heat from the food was rising off the table and the overhead light was too bright, and my nephew was looking at me with wide eyes because he could feel what the adults were pretending wasn't happening. Then I pushed back my chair, reached under the table for my bag, and pulled out a folder. It wasn't a big dramatic gesture. I just placed it on the table beside my plate, the way you'd set down a bill at a restaurant. "Since we're being honest," I said. My brother looked at it. "What is that? 4 years of bank records, Venmo transfers, text messages where each of you asked, and a spreadsheet because I'm thorough." My sister-in-law's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. My mother said, "Mara, this isn't the $47,260, I said. "That's what I've sent this family since 2020, not borrowed, given, because none of it ever came back." The table went very still. My brother picked up the folder. His jaw shifted as he read. I watched him get to the second page where I had organized everything by year and by person. Who asked? What for? What I said? What I sent? I kept my voice even. "You said the dynamic I create isn't healthy. I just want to make sure we're looking at the same dynamic." He flipped to page 4. I knew what was on page 4. It was a screenshot of a text thread him and my sister-in-law forwarded to me by accident last February. They'd been trying to send it to my mother. In it, he'd written, "She won't say no. She never does. Just ask her again and feel bad about it a little." My sister-in-law saw the color change in his face. She reached over and took the folder from him. Her eyes moved fast down the page and then stopped. "Where did you get this?" she said quietly. "You sent it to me. By accident. On February 9th. She set the folder down carefully, like it was hot. My father still hadn't looked up from his plate. I gathered my things. I didn't slam anything, didn't raise my voice. My hands were shaking, but I was careful not to show it. I stood up, folded my coat over my arm, and looked at each of them. My brother, staring at the table. My sister-in-law, jaw tight. My mother, looking somewhere past my shoulder. My father, who finally looked at me, and whose expression told me everything I needed to know about how long he had known this was coming. "You don't need to step back from someone who's already walking out," I said. I picked up the cranberry tart I'd bought, took it with me. I'd driven 4 hours. I wasn't leaving the dessert. The door didn't slam behind me. It just closed. I drove 20 minutes before I pulled over. There's a rest stop on Route 9, one of those sad little ones with a single vending machine and a picnic table that's been there since the 1980s. I parked under the one working light and sat with the engine running. The heat was on too high and I could feel my face doing something I didn't have words for yet. Not crying. Not quite. More like everything inside me was rearranging itself into a new order. I had known this was possible. I had known for a long time. The first time I wired money to my father, I was 22 and 3 months into my first job out of college. He called on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual because he usually texted, and he said there was a situation with the property taxes, and if they didn't pay it by Friday, the county could put a lien on the house. He said it the way you say a thing when you already know the answer is yes. Matter of fact, almost bored, like he was telling me the weather. I sent $1,400. He thanked me with a thumbs up emoji. That was the template. Everything after was just variations. My sister-in-law needed a new car because hers was unsafe 4 months after their family vacation to the Outer Banks, which I had not been invited on. My brother needed help with his deductible after an ER visit, which turned out to be a sprained wrist from a golf game that he also had not mentioned to me. My mother needed $600 for a procedural thing that she never fully explained, and I never fully asked about because I had learned by then that asking questions made me the problem. The worst one was the roof. 3 years ago, my brother called and told me the roof was failing, that if they didn't replace it by winter, the house could have serious water damage, that my parents were too proud to ask, but he was asking for them. He put my mother on the phone and she cried a little, which she almost never did. I sent $8,000. I had $11,000 in savings at the time. I put it on a payment plan with my own bank to cover the gap and didn't tell anyone. 18 months later, I found out through a cousin that they had used a home equity line of credit for the roof. Had used it since before my brother called me. The $8,000 went somewhere else. I never found out where. I sat at that rest stop on Route 9 for almost an hour. The vending machine hummed. A truck went by on the highway and shook the car a little. I thought about calling someone, but everyone I would call was either at that table or too far from this to understand in one phone call. So I drove home. 3 days went by. I went to work, came home, ate things I didn't taste, slept without sleeping well. On the second night, I pulled out my laptop and opened the spreadsheet I had built, the same one I'd put in the folder, and I added the final entries, updated the total, looked at it for a long time. Then I moved it to a folder labeled simply, Done. On the 4th day, my mother texted, "Just checking on you." I stared at the message for a while. I didn't answer. 2 hours later, my brother called. I let it go to voicemail. He left one. His voice was careful, measured, the voice he uses when he's talked himself into something. "Look, I think things got a little out of hand on Thursday. Maybe we should get together and talk. Not the whole family, just us." A pause. "Also, Dad's been asking about the power of attorney thing. He said you'd understand what that means." I played that voicemail 4 times. Power of attorney. Right. 2 years ago, when my father had a minor cardiac event, real one this time, though minor, I had helped him and my mother set up some legal paperwork. Basic things. I was listed as backup executor on a small trust, backup contact on 2 accounts. At the time, my brother hadn't wanted to deal with any of it, and my sister-in-law had said something about not wanting the liability, so it fell to me, as things did. I called the attorney's office the next morning. I had myself removed from everything by end of business. That afternoon, my brother texted, "Dad says you contacted the attorney. What are you doing?" I typed back, "What you told me to do, stepping back." He called immediately. I answered this time, because I wanted to hear what he would say. "This is not what we meant," he said. "I know," I said, "but it's what I'm doing." A pause. "Then, Mara, you know how much they depend on." "I do know," I said. "That's the whole point." I hung up. The texts started arriving in different configurations after that. My mother saying she didn't understand why I was doing this to the family. My sister-in-law a long message that used the word boundaries 4 times and managed to make it sound like my fault. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 2 years, who had clearly been briefed on a specific version of events, sending me a careful little note about how family is complicated and she hoped I was okay. My brother tried calling 3 more times. I let all 3 go to voicemail. In the third one, his voice finally dropped the careful tone. "You're being dramatic," he said. "You've always been like this. You take everything too far." I saved that one to a separate folder. On the 6th day after Thanksgiving, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize at first. It took me a minute to place it. My father's cell, the one he never actually used, that he'd switched to after losing his regular phone sometime last year. It just said, "This isn't how families are supposed to work." I looked at that message for a long time. Then I wrote back, "I know. That's what I've been trying to tell you." He didn't respond. I didn't expect him to. What happened next, I did not see coming. I had a work friend named Priya. We'd been close for about 2 years, the kind of close where you eat lunch together 3 times a week and know about each other's families and the way people at work come to know things, through accumulated small disclosures over bad coffee. She knew about my family in general, not the specifics, but enough. On day 8, she stopped by my desk and said, "Hey, did you see Vanessa's post?" Vanessa was my sister-in-law. I had not seen it. I pulled it up. It was one of those posts that doesn't name anyone but names everyone who matters. Written in the soft, aggrieved language of someone who has processed their feelings into a kind of public wound display. Something about the grief of losing a family member who's still alive. About how hard it is when someone you love decides that money matters more than people. About choosing peace and hoping others find healing. In the comments, my mother had written, "Prayers for our family." Drawned. A woman I'd worked with at a nonprofit 6 years ago had replied with a heart. 3 people I didn't recognize had written things like, "So sorry you're going through this," and "sending love." I closed the tab. I opened it again. I closed it. Then I called my attorney. A woman I'd used once before for a lease dispute. I had her on the phone for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, a cease and desist was being drafted. Not because the post said my name, but because she had sent a direct message to at least 4 people in my professional network, including my manager, with a very specific account of events that did include my name and several things that were factually untrue. My manager was the one who told me. She called me into her office, gentle about it, said she'd gotten a strange message and wanted to give me a heads up. I thanked her. I kept my voice steady. I went back to my desk and wrote down everything I remembered in order with dates where I had them. The cease and desist went out the next morning. My brother texted 40 minutes later, "Are you seriously involving lawyers?" I wrote back, "Yes." He said, "This is insane. Over a Thanksgiving dinner?" I said, "Over $47,000 and 4 years. But sure." He didn't respond after that. What I didn't expect was my cousin Diane. We had been close as kids. The kind of close that distance and adult life erodes slowly, so gradually, you don't notice until you realize you've stopped calling, and neither has she. She was at that Thanksgiving table, though I hadn't mentioned her. She sat near my mother and mostly kept her eyes on her food, and when my brother made his little speech, she hadn't nodded, hadn't smiled. She'd just gone still. She texted me on day 11. It was a long message. I'll give you the short version. She said she'd been in the room for a lot of things over the years that she hadn't spoken up about. Things said behind my back, decisions made without me, the way the family talked about me when I wasn't there. She said the word they used most often was reliable, but never with warmth. reliable like a utility, like something you depended on without being grateful for. She said she was sorry she hadn't said anything sooner, that she'd told herself it wasn't her place, that she understood now that silence had been a choice, and the choice had not been a good one. I read that message 3 times. I didn't cry, but I sat with it for a long time in a way that felt different from the anger I'd been carrying. Softer, somehow. More complicated. I wrote back and said I appreciated her telling me. She asked if we could get coffee sometime. I said yes. My father tried once more. He sent a letter. Actual paper, envelope, stamp, which told me either my mother had written it or he'd been really serious because he didn't do paper. It arrived 2.5 weeks after Thanksgiving, tucked between a water bill and a holiday catalog I hadn't asked for. I stood on the front steps of my apartment building and held it for a minute before I went inside. The letter was 3 pages. His handwriting, though, so it was him, or at least partly him. The first page talked about how much they missed me and how the house felt different. The second page described some health things, careful and slightly exaggerated in the way parents write about health when they want you to feel responsible for it. His knee, his sleep, a doctor's appointment that had apparently been concerning. The third page got to it. They were behind on the mortgage, had been for a few months. My brother had tried to help but couldn't cover the whole amount. If things didn't change by February, they might have to consider selling. The last line said, "We know you understand how serious this is. We know you'd want to help if you could. We've always counted on you, Mara. We've always counted on you." I folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, walked to my kitchen, got a ceramic bowl down from the cabinet, and set the envelope inside it. I stood there a second, lighter in hand, thinking about all the other times I had talked myself into it. All the other moments I had looked at some version of this, some need, some crisis, some soft appeal to my sense of duty, and decided that saying yes was the same thing as being good. I lit the match. The paper caught fast. The envelope went last. I watched the whole thing become ash, and then I set the bowl in the sink and ran the water. I didn't feel sad. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I'd made a decision that was actually mine. The holidays were quiet, quieter than I'd expected, and not in the bad way. Diane and I got coffee on a Thursday afternoon in early December. It was the kind of coffee place with mismatched chairs and too many plants and the right amount of noise. We talked for 2 hours, not just about the family, about everything. What she'd been doing, what I'd been doing, how strange it was to be adults who had once been kids at the same grandmother's kitchen table. At one point, she said, "Do you ever think about how young we were when we learned how to manage them?" I thought about it. "All the time," I said. She nodded. We ordered more coffee. On Christmas Eve, I cooked dinner for myself and 2 friends from work, neither of whom had family nearby. We made an absurd amount of food, 3 appetizers, 2 mains, a dessert that took 3 hours and collapsed slightly in the middle and tasted perfect anyway. We stayed up until almost 1 in the morning talking about nothing important. My phone had 6 unread messages from family numbers I had not opened. I let the read receipts stay off. That night, cleaning up the kitchen, I caught myself thinking about my nephew. Not with grief exactly, more with something patient. He was 7. He was not responsible for any of this. Diane had mentioned that he sometimes asked about me, that he didn't really understand what had happened. I thought about that. I didn't rush anything. But I thought about it. In January, I started therapy. I know that sounds like the kind of sentence that comes at the end of a story, like a tidy resolution. It's not. It was more like the beginning of a longer, less dramatic project, the kind where nobody stands up at a dinner table and nothing gets confronted all at once. It's just you, a chair, an hour a week, and the slow work of figuring out which parts of yourself were always yours and which parts you built to survive other people. My therapist asked me once when I first remember feeling responsible for my parents' emotions. I started to answer and then stopped because the first memory I found was from when I was 9 years old. I had known, somehow, at 9 years old that if I came home from school with good news and my mother was in a bad mood, I needed to save the good news for later. I had adjusted my own joy around her weather patterns. I sat with that for a while. Then I said, I think I've been doing this a very long time. I think so too, she said. Not unkindly. I want to tell you something that took me a while to understand. People who love you do not keep score, but they also do not ask you not to. The problem in my family wasn't that I tracked every dollar. The problem was that I had to. When you're in a healthy dynamic, you don't need receipts. Nobody's building a folder. You help each other and it comes back around, and the love is in the easy exchange, not in the fear of what happens if you stop. The folder I brought to that Thanksgiving table wasn't evidence of my coldness. It was evidence of how cold things had already been for a very long time. I was just the only one keeping records. I'm not angry anymore. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect anger to be the engine of a story like this, and it was for a while. But anger is expensive and I have other things to spend it on now. What I have instead is clarity. I know who I am when I'm not managing everyone else's feelings. I know what my apartment feels like when nobody in it needs something from me. I know that I can cook dinner for friends on Christmas Eve and laugh too loud and stay up too late and not spend 1 second of it calculating whether I've earned the right to be comfortable. I know that $47,000 is a significant amount of money, and also that it was never really about the money. It was about what the money meant. It meant I was useful. It meant they'd keep me around. I had been paying for my seat at the table, and when they decided my seat cost too much, they just said so. I'm not going back to that table, but I think about my nephew sometimes, the way he ran at me in that hallway with his arms wide open, not calculating anything, not needing anything except to say hello. Kids that age love you before they learn how. Maybe I'll be his aunt who shows up sometimes, on my terms, in my time, in a way I actually choose. That's enough. For right now, that's more than enough. If you've ever been the one everyone called first, the one who showed up, who wired money, who canceled your own plans to manage someone else's crisis, and then one day they looked at you and said you were the problem, I want you to know that I believe you. I know how it sounds when someone tells you that you gave too much. I know how it lands. I know you'll wonder if you were too sensitive, if you read it wrong, if you owe them one more chance. You don't. You can love people and still not let them cost you everything. Drop a comment if the story found you at the right time. I read every single one, and if you're watching from somewhere far away, tell me where. I want to know who's out there. Hit subscribe if you want to hear what comes next. Because trust me, there's always a next chapter. And yours is worth writing. I used to think that being dependable was the same thing as being loved. That if I showed up every single time with money, with effort, with silence, when silence was what kept the peace, eventually it would come back to me. Not as repayment. Just as basic human decency. Just as someone, someday, asking how I was doing and actually waiting for the answer. It didn't work that way. And looking back now, I think I always knew it wouldn't. I just didn't want to be right about that. What happened at that Thanksgiving table didn't come out of nowhere. It was the end of a very long road that I had been paving dollar by dollar for 4 years. Every time I wired money to my father without asking questions. Every time I let my brother's text go unanswered just long enough to convince myself I had a choice before I said yes anyway. Every time I swallowed something that should have been said out loud. I was teaching them, without meaning to, exactly how to treat me. And they were excellent students. That's the part nobody tells you about being the responsible one in a family. It's not just that people take advantage. It's that your reliability becomes a kind of permission. Your yes trains people to stop asking carefully. Your patience trains them to stop being grateful. And eventually, when you finally say no, or when you simply stop volunteering, they don't experience it as a boundary. They experience it as a betrayal. Because in their version of the story, you changed. They didn't. My brother standing up at that table, speaking in that careful, rehearsed voice, genuinely believed he was the reasonable one. That's the thing I've had to sit with. He wasn't performing cruelty. He was doing what people do when they've spent years benefiting from a system and then someone disrupts it. He was trying to restore order. The folder I dropped on that table wasn't just evidence, it was a disruption. It said, I have been keeping track while you are not. And that is deeply uncomfortable for someone who preferred I stay grateful and quiet. The $47,000 matters. But it was never really about the money. It was about what I believed the money could buy me. Safety, belonging, a seat at a table that was supposedly already mine. I was paying in every sense to be included. And when they decided the cost of including me was finally too high, they just said so. Out loud, at dinner. What I learned from Mara, from watching myself move through all of it, is that integrity is not the absence of anger. It's what you do with the anger when it comes. I was furious for a while. That fury built the folder, organized the spreadsheet, sent the cease and desist. Anger used precisely can be one of the most honest tools a person has. The question is whether you let it run past its usefulness. I didn't. And that took work. What came after the anger was something quieter and harder to name. A kind of clarity about who I actually am when I'm not performing okayness for people who aren't watching carefully anyway. I am someone who cooks too much food for friends on Christmas Eve. Someone whose cousin Diane can call after years of distance and pick back up something real. Someone who can walk a 7-year-old to school and feel something uncomplicated and good. That's the person who was always there. She just had no room. You make room by removing what's taking up the space. Sometimes that's a conversation. Sometimes it's a folder on a Thanksgiving table. Sometimes it's a match and a ceramic bowl and watching something curl into ash without flinching. I'm not asking you to do what I did. I'm just asking you to be honest with yourself about the math, about what you've given and what it's cost you, about whether the people you're holding up would hold you back if you fell. Because here's what I know now. Standing on the other side of all of it, the life you're protecting yourself for is already waiting. It doesn't require their permission. It never did.